have been playing with fabric my whole life, and I made my first quilt when I was 14. I started a pattern company called Lella Boutique, and I designed for Moda Fabrics. And I still remember the very first time I ever came across a Moda charm pack, and I can almost remember the exact date because I was pregnant at the time, and on this particular day, I got my ultrasound, and I found out that I was having a girl. And so the natural thing to do, of course, is to go straight from the doctor's office to the local quilt shop and pick out a few fat quarters, right? And so I was getting ready to check out, and there they were. There were these adorable little stacks of 5-inch squares. I had no idea what I was going to do with them, but I had to have them. And so I took them home to see what I could do, and I was just amazed to find that there were so many possibilities with these 5-inch squares. And I remember thinking even back then, one day, if I write a book, this is what I'm going to write it on. And so here I am. This is my book, Charm School. Now, even though the Moda charm packs were the inspiration behind this book, you can actually use anything in your stash to make these. You can use fat quarters, you can use scraps. Some of them take multiple charm packs, so you can substitute the 10-inch pre-cuts, layer cakes. But one thing that was really important to me was that this book be something that anybody could pick up and make projects from. So I've geared it towards beginners, but it's definitely the sort of book where you can build upon the concepts and build your skill level, and it's something that all skill levels will enjoy. The first quilt that I'm going to show you, well, actually, let me back up for a minute. The book has 6 chapters, and in each chapter, we focus on one sort of specific skill that you can apply towards your 5-inch squares. So in chapter 1, the emphasis is on keeping it simple, just keep doing as little as possible to the 5-inch squares and keeping it square. So this first quilt is called Modern Basic, and so I thought if a beginner, if a beginner is making their very first project, what sort of project would be good for them? And so I thought, well, a basic block quilt is sort of as easy as it gets, right? But I thought, okay, but how do I make this appealing to everyone? And so what I did was I placed an emphasis on fabric choice. I've used some art gallery fabrics. It's from the Arizona collection by April Rhodes. They're just really big, bold graphic prints. And then I also played around with arrangement so that it didn't look just like a basic block quilt. And then the last thing was the finishing touches. And so I had Natalia Bonner do some custom quilting, and I feel like it just takes it up to a whole other level. And it ended up being one of my favorite quilts from the book because this is something I would decorate my house with, and it's a basic block quilt. So in chapter 2, if you take a 5-inch square and cut it in half, you get rectangles. And so one of the basics of quilting when you get rectangles is sort of a coin quilt. And so this was my take on that. It's, of course, you've got these little square depots in the middle of each block. And so this one is called Railroad Crossing. And once again, very beginner friendly. But then I also wanted to show that as you progress in your skill level, there are some really amazing things that you can do with just rectangles and squares. So this quilt is called Snowfall, and as you can see, there are just a lot of different possibilities, even with just rectangles and squares. It's very simple to make, but it looks a little more intermediate than some of the others. In chapter 3, I wanted to start to introduce triangle shapes, and so I thought for a beginner, it might seem a little intimidating. I've heard this from a lot of my beginner friends. And so what I did for this first quilt, it's called Scrap Happy. And we use the easy corner triangle technique in the sashing for the sawtooth stars. And that way you can kind of ease a beginner into it. But I love it. This is another one of my favorites. It's a simple quilt, but you can use a jelly roll, you can use scraps, like just anything. So there are a few other quilts, and we start to do I teach a little bit about flying geese as another basic, and so there's some quilts using flying geese. But then I wanted to show that using that same basic beginner skill level of using the easy corner triangles, you can actually build up to some pretty impressive looking shapes. So the last quilt in the chapter is called Madam Butterfly. And so that's a bit more of like an intermediate, but it's really the same technique, which is great. Now in chapter 4, we move on to the individual triangle units, which are half square triangles. There are 2 different techniques that I show that you can apply to 5-inch squares. They yield 2 different sizes, 2 different techniques. This is one called Rock Star, and this is actually slightly different from the book. I remade this one up in my new line of fabric called Farmer's Daughter. One of the things I really love about this book, and I think that you'll love as shop owners, is it's easy to kit. You can take anything in your shop that you have and adapt it towards these patterns. Another quilt that I brought from that chapter is called Hoodwink, and this kind of incorporates the half square triangle technique and then the easy corner triangle technique. And then in chapter 5, we take the half square triangles just one step further and we get our quarter square triangles. And so the example that I brought today, this quilt is called Somersault, and I've used the Day Sale fabric by Bonnie and Camille for Moda. And then finally, in the last chapter, I decided to take a look at some of the wonky things that we can do with 5-inch squares. And so this quilt that I brought with me is called Lunchbox. It's perfect for all your leftovers. And what I started out with was a 9-patch block, and then you cut sort of a wonky cut, and you mix it with some background squares to get this look. So that's the book for you in a nutshell. I have 18 different projects in it, and I am so glad to be here and sharing my passion of 5-inch squares with you. Thank you so much.